Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and this is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. We also talk about Plum Island from times to times because they're very connected, not just geographically, but much of the history of Plum Island is tied up at the Merrimack River and vice versa. Um, Plum Island has a very interesting history, and I'm learning more about it. I'm writing a book now titled Plum Island, a Vulnerable Gem. And so this is one of the photos that I will be using when we're talking about the history of Plum Island. And I should remind everybody, this is Joppa Radio 96.3 and local cable channel 9. This is a picture of the Plum Island Hotel at the turn of the 20th century. This is about 1895 or so. And there were a few hotels on Plum Island in those days, and this was certainly one of the most desirable. It is right what we call the center now, where the Geiger refreshment stand used to be. I think it has a new name, but as you drive straight down the Plum Island Turnpike and you go into that parking lot, there is to the left a snack bar and restaurant now. Well, that's about where the Plum Island restaurant was, maybe a little closer to the road. But for many years, it was a very popular site. One of the things that brought people there in about 1900, 1905 was the hunting. There was great hunting, great duck hunting. And of course, Plum Island, as we know, was a fly position for many of the birds. So the duck hunting was very good. And there used to be huge dinners at the Plum Island Hotel. People from Boston would come and, some of them were still in horse and buggy in those days. And I think you can see that this would be a desirable place to be. This is another version of the Plum Island Hotel some years later. The original Plum Island Hotel burned in about 1913. And this is one concept that I think is largely gone from us today, a century or so later, is many things burned in those days. I think we know that in a way, but this was before regulation. This was before scientific fire departments or firefighting skills. And so a lot of things burned, and it's very too bad. But this is the Plum Island Hotel. It was rebuilt from what it had been. This was about 1915. And in 1915, this Plum Island Hotel also burned. And that was the last time it was used as a hotel. But you can see to the left, the buggies that brought people out, the stable is to the left. And it must have been a beautiful place to get on the veranda, to sit and watch the sunrise or the sunset. It looks like there's their own version of the Widow Hawk at the top of this structure, a number of fireplaces, and it was a wonderful place to stay. After this burn, it was replaced by a pavilion, which we will see a little later in the presentation. They did not put back up a hotel. And there were a few hotels on the island, including the Oliver House, which lasted until about 2014. But Plum Island in general did not have a lot of hotels. Some, remarkably, were on Grape Island, which is now part of the wildlife refuge. And I'll have some photos in my book on that. But this is such a large, stately building. It's where the center is now, where the restaurant in Plum Island is, and what a beautiful place it was. I know, as I say, there were a lot of hunters that went there, and it was a wonderful vacation spot. This is before, a little before the Plum Island Hotel. This was a bridge coming from the Plum Island Turnpike. This was the Atlantic Hotel. It was, you can see, well, you can't see, but that's the ocean behind it. So again, if you're listening on the radio, this is a less grandiose spot than the Plum Island Hotel. It's the Atlantic Hotel. It's on, you can see a wooden road that took the passengers and the horses to the hotel. And this is, as I say, not quite as colorful and grandiose, but part of the Plum Island scene in about 1895 or 1900. One of the remarkable things about Plum Island was the fact there was a transportation system that went from Newburyport to Plum Island. Here is a train that would start in Newburyport, downtown Newburyport, and it would go all the way to Plum Island. And there is a lighthouse at Plum Island, which is still there today. And it's curious that there seemed to have been more access to Plum Island in, say, 1900, 1915 than there is today. Imagine getting on a little train or a trolley and going down to Plum Island and spending a day, knowing you could get a ride back, I quickly point out. But this shows a number of the cottages on Plum Island. It shows this trolley that will take people up and back to Newburyport. And interestingly, this whole transportation system started in about 1887 with a horse and buggies, or it wasn't a buggy, it was called a barge. But 15 or 20 people would get on a large, what would look like a bus, but it would be a passenger vehicle, and they'd hook up the horses and they'd come down to Plum Island. That was 1887. In the 1890s, the train came and the horse and barge wasn't so popular. But again, this is an interesting shot that shows there was access to Plum Island. You know, people would pack up a lunch or, you know, their blankets and come down, they take the train. And we're talking 1900, 1910, as we are. A lot of people didn't have cars then. The cars were just beginning to appear. And so hopping on a trolley was a good idea. To the left, you can see some young girls. It must have been exciting to see the trolley come by and people empty out. And this was an old institution of Plum Island. Here is the steamer Carlotta on Grape Island. And if you're listening on the radio, there's a vessel, a steam-powered vessel, and it would hold probably 15 or 20 people. Grape Island is actually still exists, of course. It's part of the Parker River Wildlife Refuge. But at this time that we're looking at, probably 1915, the refuge did not exist, and there were numerous houses on Grape Island and other parts of the southern end of Plum Island. This is very interesting to me because it was great activity out there in all parts of the island. Of course, it wasn't nearly as populated as it is, but steamers would come down, and I understand as far up as Haverhill, they would pick up people. They would come down the river, they would turn up on high tide and go into the Sound, and they could get to Grape Island and even come back through and make that big circular tour. And so those were the good old days. And one thing about Newburyport did not have many steam vessels. The community was one of the greatest makers of tall ships, meaning ships that had sail, 3 or 4 masts, 100 or 200 tons. And Newburyport was actually one of the leaders in the colonies in the 18th and 19th, well, 18th century for the colonies, 19th century for the United States. So Newburyport craftsmen built hundreds of tall ships. However, once the age of steam came along and the age of iron and steel vessels, Newburyport couldn't compete. And a key reason for that is because the inlet to the harbor is so narrow and mostly it's so shallow, a 12 to 16 foot draw, depending on high or low tide. Also, there was a strong current coming to the east, and the tidal elements from the west and further from the strong current from the west, a strong tides from the east, it made for a difficult situation in moving a boat. So we did not have many steamships that were built here, but during the early 20th century, there were many vessels that went up and down the river and would go to Grape Island, which again is now part of the Parker River Wildlife Refuge. Here's a shot of the Basin at Plum Island about a century ago, probably 1910, 1920. There were many small ships, small boats there, dories. Fishermen would go out. And of course, this was depending on the tide. But here you can see part of the basin and quite a few of the smaller vessels. This is a photo that's a tad small, I must say. I shall have to do something about this. But this shows a lot of picnickers. We had talked about people could come down and they could bring a picnic lunch. Here they would be on a dune on Plum Island. I don't know how they did it, particularly the women with their skirts and crinolines and whatever. It seems like they get very sandy. But here's a postcard of the sand dunes at Plum Island. It was a wonderful place to come down, have picnics. It was quite accessible. Today, it seems like Plum Island is a little more difficult to come down. It's difficult to find parking on any street. It seems like a cottage industry on Plum Island is creating no parking signs. And it's curious, when I worked at the Daily News some years ago, I used to get calls in the morning from people, and a guy would say, geez, you know, I'm really concerned. I want to talk to somebody. And I'd say, I'm listening. And he'd say, you know, I brought my wife and 4 kids. We parked on Plum Island. We had a nice day at the beach. I come back and have a $90 parking ticket. Now, I commiserated, and I could have told him, well, you're lucky you didn't get towed away. But I didn't tell him that. I listened and I said, well, they do have strict parking regulations out there. And I think a lot of people have found that to be true. What can be done about it? I don't know. But it is true that now there is parking in the refuge. It costs, you know, $10 to $20, depending on if you live in town or not. There's parking down at the other end of Plum Island near Reservoir Terrace, and that is $10 to $20, depending on your residency. But we certainly have gone through the old days of let's get down, park the car, and let's get out and go to the beach. More planning has to be done. And there are about 20 parking spots down there, the restaurants, once you just get over the bridge. There is parking there. So I shouldn't say there's no parking, but it's not a carefree moment. And I would mention, this is the podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. I am Dyke Hendrickson, the host. We're on 96.2 FM Joppa Radio and local Channel 9 cable television. Here is the Plum Island Pavilion, which we had talked about a few moments ago. This is near the ocean, of course. It's where the center is now. And this was built after those 2 wonderful hotels burnt down. And this is about 1918, 1920. And again, people could come down. They would somehow get there, let's assume horse and buggy, but 1920, I'm thinking they're probably in one of these rail cars, or they got a ride from a friend. But the pavilion, you could dance. For a while, it was dancing every night, say in the 1915 to 1920. Later, it was, you could dance twice a week, and there was roller skating there during the rest of the week. So Wednesday and Saturday, you could come down and dance. You could picnic during the day, dance at night. And this is the 30s and 40s. You could roller skate there during the week also. That was taken down in the 40s or so, and it's no longer there. But I believe that's a bandstand on the right. You can see many, you know, some people have gathered there. And it looks like a pretty fun way to spend a day. Okay, we'll go down, have a picnic, we'll be in the sand, and then we'll do some dancing and we'll get the trolley home. So that seems like a good thing to do. And it looks like a great deal of fun. So there was a lot going on in this period of time, which was, I'm thinking, the 20s and 30s. This is another shot of the Basin at Plum Island. The Basin still exists today, of course. If you turn left on Northern Boulevard there and go down towards the fishing areas, you can turn left there, maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking 68th to 78th Street, and you can go down. It's all built up. It's, there's only a few spots where you can actually see the inlet. But a lot of people who live on the Basin in Plum Island are very, very happy. They don't get as much of the storms coming in from the ocean. They do have tides, of course, there, but they're not as affected. So I've talked to a number of people who live on the Basin side, and they're very pleased. So you can see in the background a number of large structures on the island itself. And so Plum Island, in 1910, 1920, there were starting to be more tourists and more people coming to the island. Here is the Marsh scene in Plum Island, probably 1880, 1890. Salt marsh is a commercial commodity. It still exists today. If you drive down in the fall, you can see people taking the salt marsh, and they do sell it at different places. One farm down towards Governor's Academy sells this for feed and for putting on your garden in the winter. But this was, it's quite a big industry. And the reason why the marsh scene has these raised structures, which holds the hay, is that the tides would come in. And as you can see here, you'd actually need a boat to get to where this fellow is. At low tide, of course, you can go out and do different things. But the tide had a significant effect even then. One of the big developments at Plum Island came in 1928. And a woman named Mrs. Brown, she was from Stoneham, she was a bird watcher, and she gave about $25,000 to what was then the Bird Club of the North Shore. It later was merged into the Audubon Society. But Annie Brown was a bird watcher, and she gave a great deal of money, about $25,000, to the bird clubs. And the bird clubs then bought a large part, the southern part of Plum Island. And of course, if you've been down there, that is now the Parker River Wildlife National Refuge. But she got the whole thing going. She's a real hero. And then 1928 and through the 30s, the Audubon Society was created. They merged with the bird clubs, and the Audubon Society started buying land. So by 1942, most of the southern end of Plum Island was empty of houses. Now, there were many houses there, like 20 to 30, but they were not able to build more houses. I quickly point out during the 20s, there was a plan to build about 200 houses on the southern end of Plum Island. That did not happen. What did happen was in 1942, the federal government got the idea that they wanted to have a wildlife refuge there, and particularly for waterfowl. So it would be a flyover place where birds that were migrating could come, they could rest, they could feed. They still do that today. So in 1942, the Federal Fish and Game took over the Audubon Society's holdings out there on Plum Island. So starting in 42, the federal government owned it. It eventually became the Parker River Federal Wildlife Refuge. So if you like birds, if you like open spaces, that was a good development. And as part of this, the feds decided that they wanted to eventually have the southern end of the island to be completely empty of houses. Now, as we say, there were perhaps several dozen houses out on the southern end of Plum Island. And the feds said, you can live in these houses, but after the primary owner passes away or sells it, it's over. You cannot inhabit the house. So houses were taken down in the, 2000s and 2014. In fact, 2014 marked the last original structure on Plum Island. The owner had passed away. The federal government said this cannot be inhabited by her family. That was known. So they took over the house and it was eventually torn down. I should point out through the 80s, there was a very good use of part of the southern end of Plum Island, and that was a summer camp for children and teens who had polio. That was, in the 50s and 60s, of course, polio was a great threat. It was still to some degree active after that period, but in 1987, that was phased out because the number of polio cases dropped dramatically. So the feds also said at that time, we're not going to permit a camp to be here, because I think there were medical people who, were saying, well, this is a valuable camp and youngsters who do have handicaps love it here. And I think several groups, in fact, like multiple sclerosis, I think was one of them, wanted to take it over. But the feds eventually said no. And so the camp eventually was rolled up. It's no longer there. And as I think we know now, Plum Island is basically no longer has residents there, except the birds, the animals, and so on. So it's changed quite a bit. This is one of my favorite photos. It takes a little explanation. If you're listening on the radio, this shows 2 or 3 guns or cannons pointing out towards the Atlantic Ocean. And the sign says, gun practice, Plum Island. In about 1890 or 1900, the life-saving technology had not been fully developed. And so there was something called a Lido gun that would shoot a large hook out at a vessel that was under duress. Say the vessel was 100 yards out, there was a storm, the vessel is, if not sinking, it was having big trouble, because if you get too far in, you can't tack back out again if the wind is coming from the east. So these guns would shoot this big hook out there. Hopefully it would hit a vessel. And so it could be either pulled in if there are enough guys on shore, or in a perfect world, maybe some of the crew members could actually hold on to it and slide down it and get to shore. It seems counterproductive now, but this is a great shot to show you these guns actually existed. They would shoot these long lines and hopefully that the people on the ships can catch on to them and get back to shore. Now in July, this might not be necessary, but in December or January, when it was so cold and the wind and the conditions were so overwhelming that they did not have these small boats that could go out and rescue people. I mean, that came later under different circumstances, but many times, a 16-foot boat with 5 or 6 guys in it, they could go out, say in July on a quiet day, but in December in a nor'easter, they could not get there and they wouldn't do it. So that's why they had these guns, and hopefully this line would get to the ship and people could get back from the vessel. This is an ocean front in Plum Island. I think you can see some of the, not shacks, but smaller residences in the background. And for those on radio, this is a group of 5 or 6 adults. They're having a nice afternoon at the beach. They have umbrellas, not because it's raining, I suspect, but they didn't want to get too sunburned. But the women are dressed up in long dresses, and the men have jackets and ties on, and even fancy straw boating hats. So this is, looks kind of idyllic for me. I do look back a century and a half and think, there were good days at that time. Get your umbrella, get a lunch, and go down and sit next to the ocean. And this shot from about the turn of the century, about 1905, does show you what a nice day you can have on Plum Island. Here's, of course, a more modern photo that looks like about a 62 Cadillac or Oldsmobile. And for radio listeners, this is in front of the old Sportsmans restaurant, which is out on Plum Island Boulevard. And it lasted through the 80s, because I remember going to it. But this is one of the last of the restaurants out towards Plum Island. There was talk about dancing as we did. They did have dancing here, but that accommodation no longer exists. Here's a wonderful shot from Plum Island. This is near the Charles boat ramp. Of course, there's no Charles boat there because it's winter and the boats are up on shore. But you can see, the beauty of a sunset. And a lot of people who live on Plum Island, as we said, live on the Basin side, or they live on sides with views to the west rather than towards the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a beautiful shot you can see here. It's sunset, and Plum Island's a beautiful place from many different angles. This is a shot from the state park at Sandy Point, and it probably looked like this 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And what we're looking at is the beach. There are a few gulls there, but much of Sandy Point Beach is uninhabited. There are a couple outhouses there, but generally people like to go down there because it's next to Ipswich. At low tide, you can probably walk across. It's a beautiful spot. It has not been inhabited, and it just shows you another side of Plum Island. It is, as I say, a state park, and you have to get out there early. There's about 14 to 20 parking spots out there, and frequently in the summertime, there'll be a sign. Even if you get there at 8 or 9 in the morning, the sign says, "You are too late. Sandy Point parking is all filled up. Don't bother going out there." So it's a wonderful spot. There's fishing. There's, you can see the inlet to the Plum Island Sound, and it's a beautiful spot. But I like this photo because not much has happened out there. There, many years ago, almost a century ago in the 20s, a very large housing development had been planned there for small cottages. It never happened, and perhaps just as well. So this is a scene of Plum Island and the most southern part of the island. That is about our show for today. Actually, it's not a show, it's a podcast. But this is Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. We meet once a week, but of course it's repeated. We're on 96.2 FM Joppa Radio, when local Channel 9 cable TV. And we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River and the surrounding area. That's important today. The river needs to stay clean and get cleaner. Plum Island has its own issues, as I understand it. Biologists are concerned that climate change is creating problems for many of the migrating birds, which we'll talk about in the future. But again, we love the area. Plum Island, the Merrimack River, and the North Shore of Massachusetts is a very picturesque place. So this is Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. That's enough for today. We will get together again next week where we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River and its many assets, including Plum Island. Thank you for being with us.